I am a solutions consultant with Beyond 20, and in this video we will be explaining what the different types of relationships are, as well as when you would generally use them. So in order to take a look at this, I'm going to have to open a new blueprint. And I'm going to edit relationships for a business object. Now let's say I'm adding a relationship. I want to relate my incident business object to another object in the system, and I don't know whether it should be a link or an owns, or whether I want to link by storing a key in the parent and the child, using a join table, or using a custom set of constraints. Now, you would link to a business object generally if it's a major business object that is related to this business object, but isn't generally being created by this business object or isn't going to be modified by this business object. An example of this would be problem links incidents, where a problem is related to incidents, but you're not creating incidents generally from a problem, or you're not modifying incidents from a problem. An owns relationship is quite the opposite. An owns relationship is generally only for supporting business objects, and you use an owns relationship with two objects where the parent is generally creating records of the child business object and is going to be able to make changes to the child from a tab in your form arrangement or from within a embedded form. So your owns relationships are generally supporting objects like tasks or specifics or journals, and these are going to be items that you're generally creating from the parent or making changes to from the parent. And a fun fact, or a fun way to remember this, is that you cannot own major business objects. There's a workaround and a attribute you can set on a relationship in order to display major business objects in this list and kind of work around that limitation. But generally, you cannot own a major business object through a relationship. You can only link, which is a good way to distinguish which one you should be using. Next, number of related items. You should know whether you're trying to link or own one or many different items, so there's not much explanation to be had there, although it does come into play on our links page. So I'm going to say that I want to build out a new relationship from incident to, let's say, user info. Now I'm going to move into my links page. Now since I am linking to many user infos, I don't have the option to store the user info key on the incident because there would be many of those records, and you can't store many of those rec ID fields in a single field. So the only option I have here is to store the incident key on user info, which is the correct option if I'm just selecting many different user infos to be linked to incident. And then here we'd pick the field that it needs to be stored into, and this would be the field on the child that our rec ID would be stored in. But what if this wasn't a one-to-many relationship or a one-to-one relationship? What if this was a many-to-many relationship? In that case, we'd use a join table instead of storing one key from incident on each of the user infos that were related to it, or storing the user info key on incident if it was a one-to-one relationship. Instead, if we had a many-to-many relationship and we wanted to link those two objects, we have to do so using a join table. Now in Cherwell, you can use a standard join table, which uses a built-in system table to join all of your records together, and it doesn't require very much setup. Or you can create a custom join table using a custom join table business object, and this becomes a supporting business object in Cherwell. Now this is interesting because you can expose that custom join table as a supporting object at that point, and you can then perform some operations on that custom join table and you can see the different fields that are in it. You can add in some additional fields with some auto-populate actions, and essentially you can anything that you can't do with a one-to-many relationship, you may be able to do with a many-to-many relationship if you end up doing a custom join table. But I'm not going to go into all of that because it would take too long for this video. So when you have a join table for a many-to-many relationship, you have an option for the join to have a reason. Now, the join reason is almost exactly what it sounds like. It is a reason for why you're joining two records together. This could be a role that someone plays in the given relationship. For instance, if we were on a change request and we were joining change request in user info, the reason might be that person's role in the cab, or what they're doing or why they're in that relationship. But generally, you can use a join reason for whatever you need to have an extra field for. A join reason is essentially an extra field on the join table. It doesn't exist on the parent or the child, only in the join table itself. And you'll be able to view this join reason in the relationship between the parent and child in the grid, and you can even do some calculations against it if it's a number. So your join reason, you'll give it a field name. And then you can also define a prompt for a join reason. So if you're linking two records together, you have a join reason in that relationship, you will be prompted for what the join reason is. And you can also provide a lookup table as a validation for the join reason. So if you want someone to select one of many values when they're linking two records together, then you can provide them with a list of values from a join table. Finally, you do want to check this box to prompt a user for a join reason, otherwise it generally won't be getting filled in unless you're populating it yourself. And that is about all there is to cover with join tables there. Now, there is more information about different relationships in your Cherwell Service Management Foundations participation book, if you still have it. You should be able to read up on relationships, and anything that's not covered in this video should be explained in detail there. Finally, with relationships, there is an option to audit relationships so that the parent object will journal deletions, links, and unlinks against that relationship. If you go into the advanced page, there are some options here. One of them is load immediately, which means that the relationships data will get reloaded or loaded at the exact same time that the parent object's data gets loaded. And that differs from the standard functionality in that some relationships may not load until you're actually using a piece of functionality that references that relationship. If you have a relationship that's not referenced by any fields, it's not shown in the form arrangements, then it may not load until you actually do something with that relationship. But checking the box for load immediately will cause that relationship to load as soon as the parent object loads. This comes into play at some points when you're running one steps that go to a record or do something else with a record where you're not actually viewing the data that's pertinent to that relationship. Reload data when constraints fields change. That is actually pretty self-explanatory. If your data is, if you're using a custom link that has constraints based on a field, then that field changing will force the relationship to update. And then finally, this last checkbox here for children must be in final state before owner can go into final state. This is the easiest way to make sure that a parent object cannot be closed or cannot be moved into its final state in its life cycle before all the children have. So you won't have to develop a custom workflow that checks whether there are any open records in the child relationship. You could accomplish that using this checkbox. The final type of link, which I kind of skipped over earlier, is a custom link. Now here we have two options. One of them is use constraints, which you'll be using every time. And then the other option is auto-populate, which you'll use occasionally. It really depends on what your needs are. Now I'm going to cover use constraints first. The use constraints dialog here allows you to specify a field on the child that must equal a field on the parent or must equal some other value to be included in this relationship. Now, this differs from the other options in a relationship because instead of saying that you're placing that data in the child, your relationship is going to look for any children that match a set of criteria. So if we wanted to check, or if we wanted to build a relationship where all user infos with the last name of Smith were related to the parent object, we could do that, and we'd see every one of those user infos in that relationship. Instead, you'll more than likely be picking out constraints that are based on data on your parent object, but you can also use stored values, expressions. I would recommend you don't use a prompt in a relationship's constraints. That would not work out very well, but you can also use system functions as well. So in this instance, I'm going to select an owned by on my incident, and that needs to match the full name of a user info. So now I'll have a relationship pointing to the owner, and I'm going to check this box that says auto-populate userinfo.fullname with value when adding user info to relationship. Now what this means is that the value of incident.ownedby in this bottom column is going to be placed into the userinfo.fullname field when I perform an action that links these two together. So if you have a tab and you click that linked button that lets you link an object or link a child record to a parent through that relationship, that's a link action, and that will auto-populate any values that you have configured to auto-populate. The other options for that would be if you do a create a child business object action or a create a new business object action that has a link to parent option selected. Now you can define your criteria here either that or such that they either get auto-populated into the child when you create it, or you can choose not to check that auto-populate box, and essentially your relationship will be based solely on constraints. So any items that match those criteria will show up in the relationship, but if you don't have these criteria set to auto-populate data onto the child, then creating a new child in that relationship or linking to a child in that relationship won't actually fill out the necessary information to have that child show up in that business object relationship. Finally, you have a section here for auto-populate. Now this is slightly different than auto-populating using constraints because auto-populate allows you to specify a field that gets auto-populated with a value that's not used for the constraints that are being used in your relationship. This means that if I want to link to a user info and that user info's name must equal incident.ownedby for it to be included in that relationship, that's fine. But if I want to populate other information on that user info when it's linked, then I can go ahead and include that here. Now this is really going to depend again on what your needs are, but your options here would be the same parent or child information up at the top, so you can auto-populate information either from incident down into user info, or you can auto-populate information from the child user info up to the parent in this relationship. So instead of maybe configuring 5 different fields on your parent business object to auto-populate data when userinfo.recID gets filled in, you could configure 5 different auto-populate statements here to pull in user info first name, last name, email address, full name, avatar, and other fields that would be relevant that you're storing on your parent object without configuring each field to auto-populate based off of a field change. So those are some options that you have when you're doing this on a relationship level, and it does allow you to get a little bit more granular than just what you'd have set up in your field properties. If you have any questions about Cherwell relationships, or you'd like to see other videos like this one, feel free to check out our YouTube channel at youtube.com/beyond20llc. You can also leave comments in the comments section below.